Action Man. Diary of an action figure collector.
So I guess I first got into toys. It was actually Masters of the Universe. I remember I was living in a country, I was like 5 years old or something, and the first toy I ever saw was a kid carrying a Skeletor and another kid carrying a He-Man. Kind of came to me out of the bushes, and I just thought it was like the best thing I'd ever seen. So I guess collecting toys started with He-Man and the Masters of the Universe. The family didn't have a lot of money, and I remember my mother, she was great because we were so obsessed with it. She went out and she sold a bunk bed just so we could get Castle Grayskull. So that's kind of where the passion for action figures really began. Custom action figures 1/6 scale, they are more of an adult hobby, as you can see around us. So this is kind of more so, your adult level of collecting. So a 1/6 scale, obviously 1/6 to human size. And the figures domestic range from maybe $200 up to $1,000. And as a serious collector, you're really looking at something in excess of $2,000 to maybe $4,000 a piece. So I guess what grabbed me, what started the hobby, was the Lost Boys David action figure. This figure's made by a company called Cult King. It costs about $1,000, in fact. My obsession with the Lost Boys film being my favourite movie of all time, I've got a lot of movie memorabilia related to that film, and then I stumbled across this 1/6 scale figure. So that was really the first one that got me into the hobby. Once I started, I couldn't stop, and then that led into wanting to find the rest of the gang, because there's 4 Lost Boys, obviously there's vampires. So then I kind of went on the hunt how could I actually build the other remaining members of the Lost Boys party. And through that, I guess, was the birth of my obsession for 1/6 scale. So I guess the most difficult or most challenging figure to build was the Paul from the Lost Boys. I mean, this took the better part of a year just to really figure out how to do it. The most important piece was the head. So the head, I actually found a company in LA that also worked on Robot Chicken. And I found their sculpts to be quite good. So we talked about, creating the 1/6 scale head for the market. So it was actually a world first. And then when we found that Lost Boys was still, very much in fashion, and there's a huge fan base, and now, of course, we've got the new series being made as well by CW. They agreed to do it. So I commissioned them to do the first vampire and normal head for Paul. But the challenge is really to put together that body. How do you actually replicate the costume from the film? Because those costumes were ridiculously elaborate. So it ended up being a jacket from Russia, jewelry from Hong Kong, a body from the US, gaiters and boots from Texas. I mean, it really was kind of an international build, and it took over a year just to get that piece. But I guess now the great thing is that's available to purchase on the market. So I've kind of got, number one, the first figure of its kind, and anyone else who wants to go on the hunt can actually enjoy it as well. So the figures usually, if you're kind of not lazy but you don't want to get too involved, you can just buy a sideshow figure. The sideshow figures like your Jack Burton from Big Trouble in Little China, or your Freddy from Nightmare on Elm Street, for example. They come as one piece. They've got interchangeable hands. Now, to do that, you have to use what they call a hairdryer technique. So you've actually got to heat up the joint with a hairdryer to soften the rubber or the plastic so that they'll come apart. You can change the hands and weapons and so forth. So if I was going to do what's called a kit bash, I've got an interview with the vampire figure, for example. I've got a different head and a different body and hands and feet. I've got to actually go online, usually eBay, to try and construct the figure and then use hair drying technique to put them all together, and then hopefully it works for the best. But then also the stands as well, they're custom. So there's a company called Stony Stands, and he'll actually make custom stands. So it's quite amazing how many different parts to the hobby there are and how many specialists there are for just the smallest of parts, just to do a build. It can go from base to decal to body to clothes to head to jewelry to paint. It's quite an elaborate process. If you want to go to the next level, there's also the dioramas, which I've got. I do actually have a Lost Boys cave, but that took me probably 6 months to get built, and it was all custom. So the genesis of the Joseph Lucky Revenge of the Guilo action figure was an interesting piece. I didn't want to go the 1/6 scale just yet because I was heavily involved in the Lost Boys, but on the side I managed to find a guy who was doing, I think it's a 1/4 scale, but quite elaborate, like all the joints and everything. And it's fun to do because when you get to a custom builder, you've got to take 360-degree shots of your face. You've got to show him, detailed photographs of the costumes, for example, like you can see here. You've got the dragon on the chest, like all that work counts. He's actually painted that with my costume as a reference photos. So it's exciting. It's one of those things. It's like a little childhood dream when you can pop that up and sort of tick a box. I've actually got the DVD coming out this year, but also I'm doing a custom pop for Guilo, so that'll sit nicely within the cabinet.